I will begin with the great pleasure of introducing you. So for those of you who I haven't got to meet virtually yet, I am Alaina Brenick, one of your co-chairs. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our keynote speech today. I have the great honor of introducing our speaker, Lisa Brunner. Lisa is a citizen of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation. She's advocated on the local, state, national, and international levels to bring about change to public policy that maintains the horrific realities of violence against Native women and within tribal communities. I'll only be able to highlight just a handful of her many, many accomplishments in advocacy and policy from her 22 years of work to address violence against Native women. Lisa is a founding member of the Violence Against Women Task Force for the National Congress of American Indians. Lisa was a participant of the Office on Violence Against Women Focus Group on Public Law 280, has attended the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the United Nations for 5 years, and was an active with the Global Indigenous Women's Caucus. She presented at the UN about violence against Native American and Alaska Native women in North America and testified at a thematic hearing on violence against Native women with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington, D.C. Lisa also went on record with the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs in response to Senator Akaka's Save Native Women Act and the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, 2011 reauthorization. Lisa's been instrumental with other tribal coalition women to actively advocate for Tribal Title 19 in VAWA 2005, Tribal Law and Order Act 2010, and the reauthorization and special jurisdiction provision within VAWA 2013. These actions have paved the way for significant improvements in Native women's rights. In practice, Lisa also has provided expert services to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, Department of Homeland Security, for curriculum analysis, review, development, and instruction on their domestic violence in Indian country training program. Lisa's work has taken non-traditional routes of advocacy as well. She's collaborated with artists to amplify voices of and validate the narratives and lived experiences of Native women and advocate for Native communities' rights. Lisa is one of the main characters in the play Sliver of a Full Moon and has been featured in the films It Was Rape and Arming Native Sisters. She's worked through the arts to enact social change, presenting countless trainings, invited talks and lectures, national and international testimonies, and contributing to many media projects. Lisa is looked to as an expert in domestic dating and sexual violence, human trafficking, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and predatory policing and criminal injustice among Native communities. And she has dedicated her life's work to overcoming these social injustices, advocating for Native women's rights, and intersectional and holistic health and well-being for Native communities. Unique and distinguished honors for her accomplishments include receiving the Bonnie Heavy Runner Award for her work, being quoted in then Vice President Joe Biden's speech in the 2014 White House Tribal Nations Conference, and being selected as a 2016 Bush Fellow. Finally, as I had the privilege of getting to know her, I asked what she felt was most important to highlight in my introduction, to be sure that I didn't leave out. Her answer is very much what we will hear her speak on today. What is most meaningful to Lisa, her goal in her life, is doing her best to be a good ancestor, a good sister, a good relative, to advocate to the best of her ability. To Lisa, being a good ancestor is inherently tied to social justice. And with that, I ask everyone to give what would be in person a round of applause, but in our virtual environment, a very warm welcome for Lisa.
Bonjour, hello, me Alaina for that beautiful introduction. I extend a warm handshake to all of you in this time, in this space. I will introduce myself culturally to you. Mayangan Dodam in Dunjaba, Gao Babiganaga in Dunjaba, Wase Wagakwe Indigenous. I introduced myself and said that I am Wolf Clan. I am from the White Earth Ojibwe Nation, and I am Tornado Woman is one of my names that I'm recognized in my culture spiritually. And so I'm just honored to be invited to present and to share my experience and my knowledge with you. And so I just want to again just thank the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues for the invitation to be here. I was kind of shocked at first because I wasn't quite sure how to put this together. And so when she asked me, what is the most important thing? I said, well, being a good ancestor, doing my best to be a good relative, because being a good ancestor means that we have a responsibility and we have a duty to be that good relative, to be that good community member, be that good, mom or dad, to be that good grandma or grandpa, to be that good uncle and auntie, to be that good sister or brother, to be that good daughter and son, to be that good cousin, to be that good relative. And so the work I do, I've always strived to do that. Quite honestly, if I didn't actually keep a CV, I don't think I really would know all that I've done. Because what's most important is that I do the best that I can each day to be of service to our communities, to our people, to our country, to the world, and most of all, be that good ancestor. And the other part of being that good ancestor is recognizing all that our ancestors have gifted us. All of those teachings, all of those knowledge, all of those skills, all of those ways of knowing, our languages, because we're such a diverse, beautiful culture around the world. We have such beautiful diversity of language and songs and dance and ceremony, art, a whole cadre. And the other part of being that good ancestor is that the teaching that most Indigenous communities, I would wager, around the world know and understand, that in every deliberation that we must consider the seventh generation, all of those generations that will come after us. So how are we doing that? And how are we, creating the world that we want our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and our future generations to live in and to inherit? Because what we're using today, we're borrowing from them. And so we need to remember who we are and balance ourselves. So I'm going to start with what I grew up in a home of extreme violence. I didn't know if I was ever going to live to see the next day. I certainly don't do what I do because it's a career goal. I don't do what I do because it's not an educational goal. To be quite honest, I don't have a college degree at all. I do what needs to be done. And when I was going through the interviews for the Bush Fellowship in 2016, one of the interviewers had my curricula vitae and said, "You did all of this. How come you didn't go get a college degree?" I'm like, "Because I was busy doing all of that." Because that's a lot of work, and it's hard work. And for us as Native women, as you can see with some of these statistics, we don't have the privilege of time. We didn't have the privilege of time then for me to run and get a degree, because a degree doesn't necessarily give you the authorization or the knowledge to be a good ancestor. That comes from knowing who you are and understanding your role and your responsibilities here. And growing up in that home of violence, I knew that that was wrong, and I was going to do something about it. So to me, I'm very much a force to be reckoned with, when it comes to addressing these. When trying to create systems change, yes, we want to be able to advocate for that, but we also need to make sure we demand it, because After 500 plus years of colonization, this level of violence has not changed one iota. For us as Native women, the original peoples of these lands, it has not changed. The perpetrators has not changed. The only thing that has changed is technology, clothing, medical discoveries, science, evolution, but nothing else has really changed in the course of that colonial violence being exacted against us as Indigenous people, Native American, Alaska Native people, Native Hawaiians, all of the other Indigenous peoples here on this continent. So some of these stats, and these comes directly from the National Institute of Justice or the Department of Justice. This is their own research. And so I know there was lots of talks about critical race theory. Well, there's a difference between theory and practical and practice. And so up here is factual. It is a practice that's currently in place. So it's important that when we're talking about the concepts of how do we talk about racism, how do we talk about, violence against Black people, against Native American people, against Asian people, against Chinese people, all of these things that evolved because of COVID and whatnot. That's factual and actual. So when we look at these levels of violence, you have Native women that are 2.5 more times likely to experience violence than any other woman in this country. We are 1 in 3 to be victims of sexual assault, and we are 3 in 5 to be physically assaulted in our lifetime. And more than 4 in 5 will be stalked by a non-Native perpetrator. And so and then too, if you look at some of the most vulnerable populations, of course, then is for sex trafficking or human trafficking, but in particular sex trafficking. The biggest, most vulnerable population is nobody else listed other than American and Alaska Native communities. And so at the top, you see these first 3, these 3 statistics. That wasn't even inclusive of the 570 plus federally recognized tribal nations in the country. Those statistics were for our relatives who live off our reservations in, whether it be border towns or in major cities. This one, the 4 and 5, was inclusive this time around through the Office of Victim of Crime in 2016. And then when I was working for a national Trouble Training Resource Center, I convened the first Sex Trafficking and Native Women Institute in the country. And I invited the Minneapolis Police Department because they were doing, they had a task force on sex trafficking. And I wanted to plant seeds for those travel programs that were visiting about going home and developing their own sex trafficking task force and what this would look like. And so Sergeant Grant Snyder, and this was in 2014, I want to say, this was at the end of January of the first new year. He said that 88% of the sex trafficking victims in Minneapolis, Minnesota at that time were Native women and girls. The year before, 85% of the sex trafficking victims were Native women and girls. And so I quoted him because this is what he stated: Native communities are ground zero for sex trafficking. And so when you have this level of violence, this percentage of violence occurring, it's significant when looking at our murdered and missing Indigenous women and the level of the sex trafficking occurring within our communities, both on and off our reservations. So in 2016, this is the first time that there was ever a compilation of data. And what they found was that 5,712 Native women had either gone missing or were murdered in 2016. And this comes from the National Crime Information Center. Keep in mind that it wasn't until we passed VAWA in 2005 that tribes for the first time could actually have access to federal databases such as NCIC, the National Crime Information Center. Up until that time, our tribal law enforcement and tribal nations did not have access to these databases, to these systems. We are actively the most resisted population in the country that is systematically not ensuring data is being kept in a consistent manner. And what I've been finding, because it's been really kind of challenging trying to find consistent information here, what I've been seeing with the different numbers, I'm estimating around 5,000 Native women are going murdered and missing ever since 2016. So we're roughly at around 25,000 of us. And why that is so significant is that, you know, there's only, you know, just a few million left Native, you know, of Native American people and Alaska Native people here in this country, in the world. And it is us as women, we are the ones who give birth to our nations. We are the ones who give birth to our future generations. And when we fall, when we disappear, so do our future generations to come, which is why it's so important, the work that I do and why I act in the way that I do, the work that I do, and demanding change, because we don't have the privilege of time. We're not like anybody else. We simply don't have the privilege of time. We're disappearing. And when we fall, our nations fall. And then during that same time, you had the United States Department of Justice missing person database, which we don't have access to. I mean, we might now, but there's all of these inconsistencies of tribes being able to have the data capabilities, the training, and the accessibility to be able to access federal databases. Majority of our tribes, I wager at this moment, still don't have access. But in this time, there are only 116 cases of the 5,712 that were actually reported to this database. So we are invisible in this country as Native people, and especially what's occurring, what has been historically occurring to our people. The murder rate of Native women is almost 3 times that than non-Hispanic white women in the country. And then there was a report through the Minnesota Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Task Force that was done, and that they just released in 2020. This is what they found, is that just in my state alone, we have 27 to 54 Native women who have gone missing, just missing. And so when we think about the sex trafficking and all of these pieces, and no one is keeping track of us, and what they found was poor investigations, all of these other pieces that you would see in a racist system, and an institutional racist system at that ensures that we are not a priority. So who's committing these crimes? According again to the United States Department of Justice and to their own reporting mechanisms, 67% of the sexual assault perpetrators against Native women are non-Native. Approximately 57% of those are white men. Nearly 4 out of 5 Native victims of sexual assault describe the offender as white. 3 out of 4 Native victims of intimate partner violence identify the person of a different race. Now, collectively, we as Native people, we are victims of violent crimes 2.5 times higher than any other group in this entire country. 88% of those offenders are non-Native. So this is, I call it modern cowboys versus Indians, that we're still being hunted, we're still being targeted for these for these types of violences. At one time, I did an interview with Al Jazeera, and I think her name was Kavita, the reporter. She asked me why we have the highest rates. And I said, well, it's not because of the color of our skin, because if it were the color of our skin, because we're beautiful brown, just like all of the other beautiful, diverse people in this country, you have Mexican, you have Hispanic, you have Brazilian, you have Asian, you have Hmong, you have all of these beautiful brown skin populations here. And if it had to do with specifically the color of our skin, the violence, I would think, would be equitable, but it's not. We're being targeted because of who we represent as Native women, what we represent our tribal nations. That's why we are being targeted. We are often considered exotic. So we can pass for being Asian, we can pass for being Mexican, we can pass for all of these things, all of these other beautiful, diverse, beings here. And so that makes us interchangeable, and especially in the sex trafficking industry. So I always label it as, United States systemic and institutional racism, and that it maintains systemic genocide. People are always talking about historical trauma, and I don't necessarily use that term simply because historical implies an end date. It hasn't ended. It's far from ended. Our treaties are still being violated. Right now, our people are trying to defend and protect our waters because you have Enbridge putting line 3 in, pumping crude oil from Canada, which has bitumen in it, and it's so toxic. And once it spills, you can't clean this up, people. You can't clean it up. And it's right next to the Mississippi River, which is the 4th largest river in the world. And so our people are trying to protect it because culturally, we as women, that's our role and that's our responsibility, is to protect that water. And so I will in next 2 weeks, I will be going fasting for that, for our water, because I don't know what else to do. But our treaties are being violated in this capacity. You had a road construction crew. The state gave them a permit to pump out billions of gallons of water from one of our lakes that they did not have the authority or the jurisdiction to do, in a lake that there's no water in it as it is. So what little water is there, they're taking it. And this is where our rice beds are, our wild rice, which is our tribe has recognized as a sentient being. Our wild rice is spiritual, and it has everything to do with our migration story, and it's in part of all of our ceremonies. It's an important food for us. And so, so when we think about how the systemic genocide is still occurring, it's happening. And just to give some examples, so when it talks about the Government of Accountability Office, and I do believe it was a newspaper in Colorado, also did an investigation here and found that between 2004 and 2007, the United States declined to prosecute 62% of Indian country criminal cases referred to federal prosecutors, including 72% of child sex crimes and 75% of adult rapes. And so what this means, so of the 570 plus federally recognized tribes in this country, you have 200 plus that are in non-PL 280, non-public law 280, which means that they're the ones that are under federal jurisdiction. That is the FBI, that is the BIA, that's federal courts and federal prisons. Now the 300 plus of our tribes are in what's called public law 280. And that happened in 1958 or 1953. It was a pilot project of the United States to terminate our tribe. So this was during the termination era, and trying to get rid of our tribe's sovereignty, try to get rid of our tribe's capacity to have our lands, our treaties. And so they transferred criminal jurisdiction from the federal government to the state government, which was an unfunded mandate, so there's no money, which created more lawlessness within our tribal communities. So that's just in a nutshell, kind of explaining that. And so it states, if the United States or even the relevant state government does not prosecute the non-native offender, then the offender goes free without facing any legal consequences for his actions or hers. And the native woman and or man is denied any criminal recourse against her, against that abuser, against that perpetrator. And so that's what consistently is happening. So because there was an Oliphant case, and that will be covered a little bit later, our tribes do not have criminal jurisdiction over non-natives who commit criminal offenses on our lands. We can't touch them. And predators know this. They're not stupid. We have fantastic, stupid criminals in this country, absolutely. But predators are very, very, very smart. And so I've often referred to the fact that they can come onto our tribal communities and they can literally hunt us and we can't touch them. And so when you have the feds and the states declining to prosecute sexual assault cases, for example, and we can't touch them, then what the courts are stating to these perpetrators is, go ahead, continue to rape with impunity, because we're not going to touch you. and boy, are we riddled with serial rapists. And then it's telling victims, don't bother reporting because we're not going to do anything about it, which then creates a colonial trauma response. And so what that means is that we identify with our ancestors from 500 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, to just today, right? And so how that would appear is that when I testified against the United States for human rights violations, and that's the first time Indian women, Native women from the United States has ever done so, I gave an example of a 14-year-old girl. We were, doing risk assessments and just kind of safety planning. And the question was asked, if you were raped, what would you do? And this little girl, she's 14, matter of fact, little Native girl, she said, well, my mom and I already talked about that when I'm raped, we won't report it because we know nothing is going to happen and we don't want to cause problems for our family. Her reality was not a matter of if she's raped, just a matter of when. And that I do not accept. No one should accept that. So the major legal barriers that are obstructing our Indian nations, our tribes, to enhance the safety of women living within their jurisdiction and authority include the assumption of federal jurisdiction over felony crimes, which happened with the Major Crimes Act in 1885. The removal of tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians with Oliphant in 1978. So under the Civil Rights Act, what's been imposed on our tribes. So those that commit murder or rape, we can only charge them with or sentence them with 1 year and or $5,000 fine and or both. That's all we can do. So the 1 year is you have to be, in order to be sentenced to prison, it has to be 1 year and 1 day plus. So they don't even go sit in a prison for a crime that our people commit crimes, right? So we only have criminal jurisdiction over Native people, just not non-Natives. So and then even with the Tribal Law and Order Act passing in 2010, it increased our sentencing authority from 1 year to 3 years for murder, for rape. That's it. We can stack it no more than 9 years, but it's 3 years and or $15,000 fine and or both, which is still drastically less than any state, right? So currently, even though the Tribal Law and Order Act passed in 2010 and the Violence Against Women Act passed in 2013 with the special jurisdiction that tribes now can exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-Native offenders who commit acts of domestic violence, dating violence, and violations of order for protections. That's it. It doesn't protect our children. It doesn't even protect our tribal law enforcement who are being assaulted by non-Natives on our land. This is how ridiculous this is. And even though these passed in 2010 under Taloa and VAWA 2013, most of our tribes still don't have the funds to ensure that we have the infrastructure to do that. And then, of course, the failure to fulfill our treaties that they're constantly violating. But if you look under, was it Article 1, and was it the 6, that our treaties are supposed to be the supreme law of the land, not when they're constantly eroding it. So this is where they're talking about, due to these legal restrictions imposed by the United States federal government on our nations, criminal jurisdiction on our lands is divided among federal, state, and tribal governments. Which government has jurisdiction depends on the location of the crime, the severity of the crime, the status of the perpetrator, if they're Native or non-Native, and then the status of the victim. Are we enrolled? Are we a descendant? Or are they non-Native? Then we wouldn't have jurisdiction at all. So these are the things that the jurisdictional barriers that we have to excessively have to try to maneuver. And how do you then advocate then for victims to be able to navigate a very complex jurisdictional system? And then it goes on to say that the complexity of this jurisdiction arrangement contributes to the violation of our human rights because it treats us different from all other women in this country. And it causes confusion over who has the authority to respond, to investigate, and prosecute violence against Native women. In no other jurisdiction in this country does the government lack the legal authority to prosecute violent criminal offenses illegal under its law, and I would wager to add, to protect its citizens under the law. So how does colonial violence against women continue to remain at genocidal levels? So let's look at that. I teach Anishinaabe culture, and the first thing I teach my students is colonization. And that's the factual history of the United States, not our interpretations of it. Their facts, their recordings, things that they've done. So if you look on for the international legal definition, it's found in 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide under Articles 2 and 3. Article describes these two elements, the mental element and the physical element. And then you look under Article 2. So what I did is just, it's A, B, C, D, and E. And in my class, I give them examples, just one of hundreds, if not thousands, of examples for every single one of these. So killing of members of group. So if you look in Minnesota paper in 1863, they are offering a bounty of $200. Could you imagine $200? So I did an inflation calculator that what that would equate to today would be over $4,300 to kill one of our people from the Red River to east. So that's my people. They're talking about my people here, to be able to kill us. And these are bounties. So for those who are trying to profess that Redskins is a term of endearment for us and that they're honoring us, no, they're not. They're talking about needing literally the skins off our backs, because before we didn't invent scalping, just let you all know that. The bounties before was our scalps, but then they changed it to make sure there was absolute proof that you had a dead Indian, was taking the back straps off us to show our red skin, that they actually killed us. So this was in 1863. This is just one. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. This is the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice. Well, what he's referring there to the nits, right, are the babies. So that and that's what they did. So what people don't know, that with the Sand Creek Massacre led by Colonel Shiventing of the United States Army, he led a group of men into a peace camp in Colorado and slaughtered women, children, and elders, and because the men weren't there. And they were, with pregnant women, they were cutting open their wombs, they were pulling the fetuses out and crushing the skulls with the boot of their, with the heel of their boots. They were cutting off the genitalia of women and men. They were dismembering body parts, and they decorated their horses and went through a parade down in Denver, Colorado, and then received medals for it. So when in presentations, I will often ask, and since this is a psychology conference and with psychologists and social scientists here, what is the psychopathology of a country that does that? And how do we change that psychopathology? Because it's still here. It's still happening to our people. Our men are going missing. They're being murdered by cops. We're just not in downtown Minneapolis, Minnesota in broad daylight, where people have phones to be able to capture what happened to George Floyd, his murder by cop. We're out in the middle of a geographically isolated areas on our reservations with numerous back roads and dirt roads. Then you have the deliberate infliction of the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole and in part. So you can have the Trail of Tears, the Trail of Tears with the Cherokee. And so just alone, there was estimated death toll from as low as 5,000 to 25,000. Anybody fell, they left them to die. They were just killed. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. There was forced sterilization of Native women from 1970 to 1976. Between 25 to 50% of our women were sterilized. I was born in this era. Could you imagine if it would have been my mother in 1970, because I was born in 1972, or if she was sterilized in 1971, I wouldn't be here. People want to say, oh, that's history, once you get over it. Problem is, our history is still living. So like with E, the forcible transferring children of the group to another group. This was the boarding school era from the 1870s to the 1960s. This was by the United States government. All of this is sanctioned by the United States government. And the churches here with the boarding school era. It was here through the churches that they introduced child abuse, child sex abuse, cultural genocide. They tortured our children and then they murdered them. The priest and their lay people who raped those little girls that were forcibly put into boarding schools, once those babies were born, there are stories that are accounted for talking about the priest bringing that baby wrapped up, opening up the furnace and throwing that baby into the furnace, and they could hear the baby screaming and then the smell of burning flesh. In Canada, they have recently discovered all of these mass graves of all of our children that had been murdered and put into these mass graves. They haven't even begun, you guys, to look here. So Deb Helen from the Department of Secretary, they're creating a boarding school investigation to start looking. And so when people say, this is, get over it, our history's still breathing, they're still living. I was talking to an elder who called me and was crying, and he was having a hard time because people are coming to him for healing. And he goes, I don't even know how to even begin to help them there. He goes, when we were the kids that were forced to dig those graves and bury those babies. So this is still very much here. And the thing is, this country has yet to atone for what they've done. They have yet to even begin to apologize for what they've done. And yet we're constantly under siege. Our people are under siege, especially us as women, because we're the ones who give birth to our nations and our future generations. This is not by accident. Understand that colonization and systemic genocide is a current affair in the United States, and that we need to be starting to demand accountability. What can this society that you're all participating in can do to address some of this? You had the immigrant detention facilities, was it down in Texas or Georgia, that the women in these detention facilities were being forced to have full hysterectomies. They're forcibly sterilizing them. And then look at this little baby. He's in a cage. Seeking asylum in this country is not illegal. But you know what is? Kidnapping children at the borders and putting them in cages. Just because it's law doesn't make it right. It's important to understand factual history, AKA critical race theory of the United States, and that we have a responsibility to truly educate ourselves and then to educate others. Over here, I've seen this Facebook meme talking about education is not memorizing that Hitler killed 6 million Jews. Education is understanding how millions of ordinary Germans were convinced that it was required. Education is learning how to spot the signs of history repeating itself. Well, then I applied it to the United States. Education is not memorizing that the United States killed millions of Native Americans and Indigenous peoples and enslaved millions of Black people. Education is understanding how millions of ordinary Americans were convinced that it was required and actively participated and still are. Education is learning how to spot the signs of history repeating itself and then doing something about it. So highlights of some of the critical roles of advocating and then added demanding systemic change is one, I'm a mother and I'm a grandmother. I'm a daughter, sister, auntie, I'm a relative. For me, is being that good relative and trying really hard to be that good ancestor. We're humans, we make mistakes, you know, we all have our fair shares. Wisdom comes from learning from those mistakes and not repeating it, right? But also engaging in community work, working with, you know, being invited to other communities around the country, but also in my own community, restoring our cultural ceremonies and healing. With trauma, we absolutely can heal, and we can move. We can be, you know, we have people who survive, absolutely, but we can move to a place where we thrive. We can thrive, and we still can be a force of good. And so it's just really important that our community understands that we can heal from these things, and we need to actively, you know, heal from these things. And then, as Alaina introduced some of the the public policy work that I did. I don't know how I end up finding myself in places and spaces like I am here today. I'm just very blessed and honored to be here and to share this work. Again, it's not about educational goals or a career goal. It's about how seeing what's wrong and doing the best that we can do to really make a difference and be effective in making that difference. So each year I get invited to speak to the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth for a social work class, and they're supposed to develop a policy brief. Well, it's not just an easy thing to do a policy brief. And so I walked them through the process of how we created policy change and how policy briefs come about. And the one thing I tell them is that find something that speaks to you and that, excuse my language, kind of pisses you off, and that it should enrage you. Use that energy to be a force of good. That's where public policy work kind of comes from. But then again, I ask you as psychologist and social scientist, what kind of society do we live in which we have to wait until the most horrific things have to occur before we create the laws to respond to try to respond to it? And even though we may have laws in place, they're still not necessarily effective as they need to be, but just food for thought. Now, the work around the films and theater and being in the sliver of the full moon, I was invited to and actually flown into DC to give this interview. And even though, you know, I'm not an artist and I'm not an actor or things of that nature, I kind of didn't understand, right? Well, like, going to create theater, how's that going to impact anything? So I was skeptical, but I participated and being able to tell those stories. And actually, Sliver of the Full Moon comes from my interview. And because one of the last questions that Mary Catherine Nagel asked me was, what does VAWA mean to you, the Violence Against Women Act? And it was evening, and because I was the last one to be interviewed that day, or the last one, but I looked out the window and there was this huge, big, beautiful full moon, grandmother moon. And it was just this beautiful orange, and it was really low. And I said, VAWA is just the sliver of a full moon of what we need to be protected. And so that's how the play was named. And after our first play, you know, to be able to put that show on, one of our grant managers and one of our, you know, in the federal, I think it was FIPSA, she comes up and she goes, Lisa, she goes, I understand violence against women. I understand it. She goes, but this, she goes, it caused me to help me to reflect that, no, I really didn't understand it. I was looking at the numbers, I was looking at the atrocities, but I wasn't hearing the stories. And that's when I had my aha moment of how powerful films and theater can be, because it's not just my voice. My voice is echoing the voices of my ancestors. It's echoing the women of my community today. It's echoing the women in my family. It was echoing the voices of my daughters, what I have been trying desperately to prevent and to protect and was not able to do. It was raped by Jennifer Baumgartner. She was looking in that particular film is how we can transition from being that victim, right? And what work we're doing today to create change and to be able to talk about those rapes, because I was raped. I was sexually abused throughout my entire childhood. And so to be able to talk about those and get into be a place where we can create effective change and use that. The energy's there. You know, we can never forget what happened to us, but we can sure use that energy and transform it for the power of good, instead of one that it can be self-destructive. Because what I'm seeing in our communities, and of course in our tribal communities, our access to mental health and all of these things there are so many barriers to that. We are not the only ones that have issues with alcohol and or drugs. Statistically, if you look nationally, the ones who have the problem with alcohol are white people. We're fifth on that list, but we're often being depicted as a stereotype as drunken Indians. No, we actually have the highest abstinence rate. I myself, I don't consume alcohol just because culturally it was never part of our society and part of our cultural way. So, and then Sisters Rising, it was previously called Armin Native Sisters, and then they switched it to Sisters Rising, and this is with Willow O'Farrell and Brad Heck. And that too is just talking about the complexities of systems, the jurisdictions of systems, and all of these the voices of those that are echoing again the voices of our people. And so if you haven't seen them, definitely look for them and view them, or if there's something that you can use in your coursework or in the work that you may do. So wasn't just my work, wasn't just me. It takes a collective to create that change. And somebody took a screenshot of the Many Faces of Violence Against Women Act of 2013. It took our non-Native allies. It took congressional people. It took our tribal nations. It took our advocates from all over the country. It took all of these different people to come together and work hard and work collectively, and that we had a common goal and to be effective in that common goal. In the next reauthorization of VAWA, there's going to be a full restoration of tribes' jurisdiction over non-natives. Up until 1978, we had better court systems than the United States government, because we understand the importance of help, healing, and restoring, right? You hear these buzzwords of restoration, restoring our felons back into communities, all of these things. Well, our community has always known this for millennia. When someone was misbehaving, we would redirect them and restore them back to how they're supposed to be, right? How to be part of that community. So we actually had some good court systems prior to Congress stripping that. And if you look at some of these, when they're on the floor in Congress in 2013, you will hear some of the most racist, archaic ways in which they talk about our people and our nations. They still use the same rhetoric of the, when they got here, and especially in the court systems in the 1800s, we're savages, we're heathens, we're all of these things. No, we were actually the ones that were more civilized, because we were not raping, we were not torturing, we were not trafficking. Not that we were perfect societies, but we don't have language for such things. And so, again, it takes a collective, and how can we all be working across across our disciplines to really create effective change, because what we're doing is not working. I mean, we're making a way, but we're making that path. But for us, we're actually running out of time. So if you're going to work with our communities, with tribal communities, step beside us. Don't stand in front of us. We don't need you to talk for us. We are capable of speaking for ourselves. This is where parallel development, which I think I didn't correct the spelling, parallel development comes into play. We know what our issues are, and we have the solutions. So we need you to work beside us and not in front of us. We can speak for ourselves, so please don't silence our voices with yours when speaking to our issues. That's my 45-minute marker. I'm almost done. And so we have the capability to articulate and the intelligence to articulate our own issues and what needs to be done. And most of all, do not appropriate our identity. We have those that have done so, especially in the movement of violence against our women, because it's not like there's, I don't know where they're getting money, how they get money, whatever. I don't care. But what I care about is when you have non-natives who are appropriating our identity, discovering that they have descendancy. I don't care if you took Ancestry mold swap thing and found 5% native in you. If you don't know who you are, and granted, we have had lots of our children being adopted out that don't know who they are and finding their way back. It's not in disrespect to them, but don't all of a sudden discover it and then become a descendant of it and then become us, and then thinking you can speak to our lived realities or to our history. And there are plenty out there that are doing that, unfortunately. So just work with us collectively, respectfully, and beside us. If anything, support and uplift our voices so that we can be heard, that we can be seen, because we are invisible in this country. And something to ponder, like the miner's canary, the Indian marks the shifts from the fresh air to poison gas in our political atmosphere and our treatment of Indians, even more than our treatment of other minorities, reflects the rise and fall of our democratic faith. Our tribal nations are sovereign nations. We are the only group of people in this country that have treaties with the United States government and have government-to-government relations. If they can treat us like this, what can and are they doing to you? So I just want to say miigwech. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy. Thank you for your work. And thank you for all you do.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I can speak for the rest of our attendees and say that we have learned so much, and that it is clear that you continue to be a good ancestor. I would like to remind our attendees to please feel free to write your questions in the chat. For Lisa, we've had an incredibly powerful talk so far. I have a few questions to start us off with. One of the questions you have already answered since it was asked. It spoke to the ways that social science research may have been harmful to Native women, that access to data has been helpful in raising awareness about the prevalence of violence against Native women. But were there ways that social science has also been harmful, and ways that we as researchers and practitioners could be better allies, better accomplices? And I believe in your slide with the diagram, you spoke to the ways that we can do that better. If there's anything that you wanted to add, please feel free, of course. But I feel that that was a great question, and it was very nicely addressed in your speech as well.
Thank you. The other, just basic respect, making sure you're working with the credible people within the tribe and talking with the tribe. Our tribes do have RRB processes, and being able to do that, because historically, unfortunately, when scientists or researchers were coming into our tribal communities, it was mostly just extracting data to promote or whatever their papers, and we don't see anything, we don't hear anything back. Even I think it was the tribe in the Grand Canyon, they came under a false flag, if you will, and extracted blood, and it had to do with diabetes research, and it had nothing to do with it. And so just being just authentic, being true, and being respectful, and just being very that we can see you, right? See the intent, and working with the tribe. And how can your research also benefit us, and not just your project or your paper or whatever? That there has to be a benefit to coming into our tribal communities that can support what we're doing. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question. In April of 2021, the Bureau of Indian Affairs within the U.S. Department of the Interior created a new missing and murdered unit to increase collaboration across federal agencies. Do you think that the new unit will have an effect? And if not, what actions at the federal level could make a major impact?
Again, this is under Deb Haaland, which I really appreciate, right? Because she was the first Native American ever to sit in such, a cabinet position of this entire country, first ever. So thank you for the questions. I think it has the potential, absolutely, because what happens is that we're so fragmented on so many different fronts in this country that it's hard to know who's doing what, right? And what kind of oversight is occurring. I think that will kind of expand the peripheral view in that context to see what from their lens, what they're actually seeing. And hopefully they're bringing forward, advocates and tribes to be at the table to help with these discussions, because at the end of the day, we're the ones that are responding to the victims in our communities, not them. And so, just ensuring that we're at that table will help hopefully make that difference. But again, it also comes back to ensuring that no matter what position you go into in any federal sector or social work or whatever, you should have an element of actual, really good compassion, and take the time to truly go to the people within your demographic area and ask them questions. Because what happens, you have institutions that tell you how you're supposed to operate. And what I tell these social workers at the College of St. Scholastica, just because it is doesn't mean it should be. Just because it is, should it be so, right? You should be questioning, the way the system is, it has to evolve. And we need to start evolving these systems. So hopefully what they develop will be fast acting, because we need it to be, and kind of help evolve what this systemic response has been.
And there's a related question. We have a question saying, I'm hearing a greater need for sovereignty of tribal law enforcement. Obviously, this differs from US state law enforcement as a colonizing force. But how do you see this need in relation to calls for reduced power of law enforcement?
So I think, I know because that had to do with George Floyd, correct? With the murder of George Floyd and the outcomes of that. Again, I think what this comes back to when we think about the psychology of the system and how it's operating, because the law enforcement is literally the boots on the ground. That is the arm of the United States justice system. And if they are acting in bad characters, it's not just that officer, it's the entire system that has created that to occur. And it's not that we don't want law enforcement response in our community. We do. On my reservation, it encompasses 3 counties. We are 1,300 square miles. We have 3 county law enforcement, and we have tribal law enforcement. And because of Tribal Law and Order Act, we did what's called a reassumption of concurrent jurisdiction back to the feds. So we have the feds, and yet it's still not enough. And it's not enough because we have law enforcement that need training, and we have law enforcement that I don't know why they're here, which are predominantly white. Are we getting the best of the best? I don't know. We have fantastic law enforcement, and trust me, I do come from a law enforcement family, so I don't have a disrespect for law enforcement, because I just pray for my relatives to be able to come home tonight safely, right? So I know that's there. But the tribe's sovereignty has to be and should be upheld, and stop with the erosion. Because when Alphont occurred, that was an erosion of our tribe's sovereignty to hold anybody on our lands. If I fly to Delaware, or if I go to California, or if I go to Egypt, I am subject to the laws and jurisdiction of those places. But if you are a non-native coming onto a tribal land, you are not subject to our criminal jurisdiction. Civilly, we can give you a speeding ticket. If you're violating DNR, we can give you a ticket. We can repossess your car or whatever. We can issue divorce decrees. We can issue protection orders and child protection orders, but that's all we can do. Nowhere else in this country can that happen. So that makes it really complicated for our tribal law enforcement to protect all citizens. We have more non-natives who live on our tribal land here in White Earth than we do our own people. And so it's about protecting public safety. And at the end of the day, that's what we should be looking at. And yes, it's not just law enforcement that, people were saying defunding or whatever. No, they should not be so militarized as they are, because I was in the Cannonball River at Standing Rock, and I thought I was literally going to die, because thinking, all we need is somebody to shoot a gun, a shot fired, and they were because they were chomping at the bits. We were going to be dead literally in the water. That's how I felt. And so it shouldn't be like that. And our law enforcement should not also be the arms and be militarized by corporations to protect their interest. Their job is to serve and protect the community and public safety, not the interest of government, of corporations and things of the sort. So the system itself needs to be revamped. To what is the psychological evaluations that are occurring? Because how are we getting rapists? How are we getting pedophiles? How are we getting drug dealers and traffickers and murderers within our law enforcement branches, right? How can we weed that out? What needs to be done to revamp these systems? We should be looking at the system as a whole, which includes judges. It should include prosecutors, right? And defendants, attorneys, and it should include the entire system. So we need to be looking at the totality, right? That peripheral view, than just narrowing just on law enforcement.
Thank you so much for that. It seems like there's a great deal of what you were talking about, knowing the answers and seeing where the systems within the tribal community can and are functioning well, and the colonizing systems are preventing that function from taking place. It also seems like they're great avenues where, to speak to Andrea Miller's question, where our psychological research can come in and show where that dysfunction in the system is happening, to help provide those data to support the changing of the system as we're trying to promote with this conference. Thank you so much for that answer. So I'll move on to the next question. The conversation around missing and murdered Indigenous women often concentrates around sex trafficking side of human trafficking, but they rarely hear about labor trafficking issues. Does labor trafficking also pose a serious risk to Native American, Canadian, and Alaskan women?
Absolutely. Well, and our people as a whole. So statistically, the majority of those that are trafficked in the United States is, for females, it's sex trafficking at 70-some% just for the country. Of course, our data is not there because we're not being captured in that capacity. And then for men, again, around the 70-some% for the country is labor trafficking. And so in our community, is labor trafficking occurring? Absolutely. Because we live, we're right next door to North Dakota. And so we have lots of big agricultural lands, which means lots of agricultural farms. I have been told stories about our men going working for some of these bigger farmers for cash. And then after, they use them for, especially now is harvesting in a lot of these fields. Once they are done, they're promised a big check, and then they drive them out in the middle of nowhere and kick them out, and of course don't pay them. So yes, those types of things are actively occurring in our territories. I was actually on a national working group regarding the labor trafficking in DC, and so rural America is really not on the radar as much as it should be. And could be, right? And so more research should be done in that capacity with farm laborers. You have, especially if you look in high poverty areas, I think you would see more exploitation of labor trafficking occurring as well. And so unfortunately, our tribe is one of the highest, we have the highest poverty in the state, and the highest poverty of the other tribes in the country. And so it's, those are very much vulnerabilities for those for labor trafficking to occur.
Thank you so much. And we have time for one last question. The Roman Catholic Church's response to the recent discoveries of mass and unmarked graves across Canada has been dismal. Recent reports have also illustrated the Roman Catholic Church has been unwilling to share historical records with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and have failed to provide millions of dollars that were promised to Canada's Indigenous peoples, while simultaneously having raised some $300 million for church renovations. I wonder if you could share your stance on the damage done to reconciliation efforts when such an important institution refuses to engage in the process. And I also wonder if you would talk more broadly about reconciliation efforts in general that need to be done to the community for all of the ongoing atrocities that are continuing to take place.
Before we can get to a place of reconciliation, there has to be accountability and responsibility. So Canada has not really done that. They're trying to skip through that. Oh, we're sorry. Here's some money. But yet now we're discovering all of these babies, right? And so with the Roman Catholic Church is also the Vatican. So what people need to understand, and the first thing that I teach my students in our class is about where did this drop of water, when you drop that water in a calm, when there's calm, and where did that ripple effect of colonization come from? It came from the Vatican. It came from the doctrine of discovery in the early 1400s. And that doctrine of discovery, and in that doctrine of discovery, if they came across people who were not Christians, then they were enemies to Christendom, like they were a kingdom. And they could take whatever they wanted, and they can traffic, they can enslave, and they can murder, and they did. You had the Vatican split the world up and gave the Kingdom of Portugal the Western Hemisphere, and then Spain wanted a piece of the pie, and so they gave Spain the Eastern Hemisphere, and that's how we ended up with Columbus. And so, you know, the subsequent papables that came after that, again, and what people don't know here in this country, in the United States, the doctrine of discovery is embedded in federal Indian law. So when the United States claims separation of church and state, they're full of it. That's not true, because the doctrine of discovery, if you look in the Marshall trilogies, you know, in US Supreme Court case laws, how the doctrine was utilized to ensure the stealing of our lands, and they're still after our lands. You think about 80% of the world's biodiversity that's left is in indigenous communities, right? It's in, you know, it's around the world, and we're desperately trying to protect it. So for some of you, you know, those researchers, come help us, because come help us with the data and the research we need to protect these things. So the Vatican has to take accountability, and they have yet to do that. And you know what? In the work that I've done at the United Nations all those years, the indigenous peoples from all over the world have all come to say, and in their statements, rescind the doctrine of discovery, rescind the papal bulls, dismantle is the other one, the doctrine of discovery, dismantle those papal bulls. And you know what? They're still active. The Vatican has not rescinded them or dismantled them because they're making money. And I'm sorry, but the Vatican is the oldest and the largest pedophile ring and criminal industry in the world. Because when you had these kingdoms, Spain and Portugal, raping lands and raping the people of their metals and the golds and the diamonds, how does the Vatican create a wealth of 38 billion plus? How did they get all of this art? How did they get all of these things? They have their own zip code. They have their own military. The Vatican themselves could abolish hunger and homelessness globally. Why haven't they? Where in the teachings of Christ is that at? So the Roman Catholic Church, of course, they're going to exploit, and it's making their monies to rebuild their churches or whatever, you know, and not forking over the documents is because they don't want to be participating, and they should be criminalized. They should be arrested. All of those priests, all of those nuns that actively participated should be arrested and held within a court of law. You can't get to a place of reconciliation until accountability and people and the church is taking responsibility for what they've done. In the United States, it hasn't even started here. When I seen Deb Haaland's announcement of the Department of Interior creating the investigation or whatever it was for the boarding schools here, I sent out a prayer, and actually made a post about it of, I pray for all of those that are on that committee investigating this, because what they're going to find is going to be really traumatic and heartbreaking. I pray for our communities that are going to be re-traumatized by what they are discovering. And I pray for all of our little babies. May they be found, and may they be sent home in honor and in love, and that they were never forgotten. So thank you.
Thank you so much for such a powerful and meaningful talk today. We truly are honored and humbled to see all of the work that you have done to be a good ancestor and to help guide us on our paths to do right and to do better in our work. We thank you for your time, and I thank everybody who's attended for your thoughtful questions, and we hope to encourage great collaborations and support for Native women's rights and Native communities.
Thank you, Miigwech.